Hello.
My sister and her husband wanted me to be their servant and babysit their kids while they partied. When I first stepped back into my childhood home after graduating college, I was hit with a wave of nostalgia. The creaky stairs, the faint smell of my mom's lavender candles, even the dents in the walls from years of sibling chaos. It all felt like a warm hug. But that comfort faded quickly. I had planned on staying temporarily while I figured out my next move. Instead, I was met with an unexpected reality. My parents needed help. Financially. My dad's hours at the factory had been slashed, and my mom's small business was struggling to keep up with rising costs. They didn't come out and ask immediately, but their hints were unmistakable. I found myself picking up a local job to contribute to the household. It wasn't glamorous, just shifts at a nearby diner, but it kept the lights on and groceries stocked. At first, it felt good to help, like I was repaying years of love and sacrifice. But as weeks turned into months, my routine became a numbing cycle. Work, home, dinner with my parents, repeat. The lively dreams I once had about exploring new cities and building a life of my own faded into the background. Instead, I was folding laundry while my parents caught up on TV dramas, feeling more like a tenant than a daughter. Then Jessica arrived. My older sister and her picture-perfect family swept into the house like a hurricane. Jessica, with her ever-polished look, her husband Ethan, who always had the right thing to say, and their two kids, Chloe and Caleb, who managed to be both adorable and completely exhausting. They came for what was supposed to be a short visit while their new house was finalized. Jessica's arrival shifted everything. My parents practically lit up when she walked through the door. Mom's tone grew warmer, and Dad's laughter became louder. Suddenly, my achievements, small as they were, seemed invisible. They doted on Chloe and Caleb, calling them little miracles, while I was relegated to an extra set of hands. Setting the table, cleaning up toys, running errands. Emily, can you grab some more juice for the kids? Emily, did you fix the Wi-Fi? Emily, don't forget to pick up milk on your way home. It was endless. What stung the most was how effortlessly Jessica commanded attention. Her stories about PDA meetings or Ethan's big promotion at work had Mom and Dad hanging on every word. Meanwhile, if I so much as mentioned a challenging day at the diner, it was met with lukewarm acknowledgement. I didn't blame Jessica, not entirely. She'd always been the golden child, the one with the straight A's and the scholarships. She was the shining example, and I was the other one. Ethan, for his part, was polite but distant. He stayed out of the family dynamics as much as possible, instead focusing on his laptop or keeping the kids entertained. Chloe and Caleb, while sweet in their own way, treated me like a live-in babysitter. They spilled juice on the carpet, drew on the walls, and demanded attention at every turn. And somehow, it was always me who ended up cleaning up the mess. The tipping point came one evening during dinner. Jessica's family had taken over the dining table, with Ethan sharing an elaborate story about his recent business trip. My parents listened intently, laughing at all the right moments. I sat at the far end, quietly eating, feeling more like a ghost than a part of the conversation. When I tried to chime in about something that happened at work, my words were drowned out by Caleb's shriek of laughter as Jessica tickled him. Afterward, as I cleared the table alone, I felt the familiar sting of being overlooked. It wasn't just about Jessica. It was about how easily I'd slipped back into the role of the spare child, the one who filled in gaps but was never the focus. I'd worked hard to grow beyond that during college, to build my own identity, but being back home was erasing all of it. By the time I finished, frustration was boiling under the surface. My parents were in the living room, cooing over Chloe and Caleb as they played with blocks. Jessica was on her phone, probably texting friends about her crazy family. Ethan was on his laptop, oblivious to everything else. And I stood there, invisible, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. It was in that moment I realized something had to change. This wasn't the life I wanted. It wasn't even a life I recognized as mine. But as much as I wanted to break free, I couldn't see a way out yet. When my parents sat me down to discuss something important, I didn't think much of it at first. But as they explained their decision, my stomach twisted. Jessica's kids needed more space to play and sleep, so they decided my room was the perfect solution. I'd be moving to the basement, a damp, cluttered space filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes. It didn't feel like a discussion at all, just a declaration. I swallowed my frustration and moved my things downstairs. It wasn't just the physical space that bothered me, though the basement's musty smell and lack of sunlight were enough to dampen anyone's mood. It was the symbolism. I was being pushed aside to make room for Jessica's family, a clear reminder of where I ranked in this household. The basement offered no privacy. Chloe and Caleb treated it like their personal playground, barging in to explore my belongings or drag their toys around. I'd find crayons melted into the carpet or sticky fingerprints on my laptop. Jessica would give a half-hearted apology when I brought it up, but nothing ever changed. Ethan stayed conveniently detached, either too oblivious or unwilling to intervene. Meanwhile, my responsibilities at home grew heavier. My parents began leaning on me for everything. I cooked meals that Jessica's family devoured without so much as a thank you. I cleaned up after the kids. Juice spills, crayon marks, toys scattered everywhere, while my sister scrolled on her phone or caught up on her favorite shows. Even the laundry, which once felt like a shared chore, became my burden. I'd watch Jessica load the washer with her family's clothes, only to leave them for me to dry, fold, and distribute. What stung the most was the indifference. My parents didn't seem to notice or care how much I was juggling. They were too preoccupied with entertaining Jessica and her family, ensuring their visit was comfortable. I began to wonder if they even saw me anymore or if I had become invisible in the shadow of Jessica's glow. The breaking point came one evening after dinner. I mustered the courage to sit everyone down and address the imbalance. I explained how overwhelmed I felt, how I was contributing financially and physically while Jessica's family added to the workload. I suggested we divide responsibilities and expenses more fairly. It seemed reasonable, even necessary. But instead of understanding, I was met with backlash. My mom's face twisted with disappointment, and she accused me of being selfish. Jessica chimed in, saying I was making a big deal out of nothing, that family helps family. Ethan stayed silent, which somehow felt worse than if he'd joined the criticism. My dad's attempt to mediate only made things more frustrating. By the end of the conversation, I felt more isolated than ever. No one seemed to care about my perspective. I was the villain for asking for fairness, the ungrateful daughter who couldn't appreciate the importance of family unity. As I retreated to the basement that night, I couldn't shake the growing resentment bubbling inside me. Something had to give, but I didn't know how much longer I could hold everything together. The breaking point wasn't a loud explosion. It was quiet and calculated. Jessica and Ethan decided to leave for an impromptu date night, and without any prior warning, they handed me the responsibility of watching Chloe and Caleb. My protests were dismissed with casual remarks about how I was already home anyway, as if that justified their complete disregard for my plans or my feelings. By the time the door closed behind them, I stood there, stunned, as the kids began tearing through the house like a tornado. It wasn't just the immediate chaos that overwhelmed me. It was the realization that my life had become a series of sacrifices for them, for my parents, for everyone but myself. I was no longer living. I was merely existing as a tool for their convenience. That night was a disaster. Caleb spilled juice all over the kitchen floor, and Chloe managed to knock over a shelf of books in the living room. Every attempt to enforce order was met with whining and tantrums. By the time Jessica and Ethan returned, I was drained and furious, but they walked in with carefree smiles, oblivious to the mess they'd left behind, both physically and emotionally. The next morning at the diner, my exhaustion must have shown because Lauren, my coworker, pulled me aside. She'd been one of the few bright spots in my life since moving back home. She had a way of making people feel seen, and that day, she noticed I was drowning. She suggested we take a weekend off and visit a nearby resort. Just the thought of a break, real rest, away from the constant demands of my family, felt like a lifeline. I hesitated at first, knowing how my parents and Jessica would react. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't keep living like this. When I got home, I tried to frame the idea as reasonably as possible. I told my parents I needed a break, just a weekend to recharge. Jessica overheard and immediately jumped in, accusing me of being selfish and shirking my responsibilities. My mom chimed in, saying it wasn't the right time for me to leave, not with so much happening at home. My dad, predictably, stayed neutral, offering no real support. The argument escalated quickly. Jessica brought up every little thing she'd done for me in the past, most of which were years ago and hardly relevant now, while ignoring everything I'd done for her family since they arrived. My mom's disappointment was palpable, and it cut deep. But for the first time, I didn't back down. I told them I was going whether they liked it or not. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and anger, but I didn't care anymore. For once, I was putting myself first, and it felt terrifying but also empowering. As I walked back to the basement that night, their voices still echoing in my head, I felt a shift within me. This wasn't just about a weekend trip. It was about reclaiming my life, setting boundaries, and refusing to be buried under their expectations any longer. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally making a choice for me. The next morning, the house was a pressure cooker ready to explode. The tension from the night before lingered, thick in the air. I barely made it up the stairs before my mom cornered me, her disapproving glare piercing through me. She started in on how selfish I was being, how family was supposed to stick together. Jessica, ever the golden child, joined in, her voice dripping with condescension as she listed all the ways she had sacrificed for me over the years. Ethan stood silently in the background, as usual, offering no support but making his presence known with a disapproving frown. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The years of pent-up frustration and resentment came pouring out. I laid it all bare. How I'd been treated as an afterthought my entire life, how my efforts to support the family had gone unnoticed while Jessica's every move was celebrated. I brought up the endless sacrifices I'd made, from working extra shifts to help pay bills to becoming an unpaid babysitter for Jessica's kids. I told them how small and invisible I'd felt in my own home, how their constant dismissal of my needs had crushed my spirit. My words hit like a storm, leaving no room for them to deflect or interrupt. My mom's face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a rebuttal. Jessica looked shocked, perhaps not expecting me to finally stand up to her. But as the weight of my truth settled over the room, their shock quickly morphed into anger. They accused me of overreacting, twisting my words to paint me as ungrateful and dramatic. My dad's voice cut through the chaos, urging everyone to calm down, but his neutrality only fueled my resolve. I wasn't looking for a mediator. I was done trying to win their approval. I looked them all in the eye and said the words I'd been too scared to admit before. I was leaving. I wasn't going to keep paying bills or sacrificing my time and energy for a family that didn't value me. The room erupted. My mom pleaded, telling me I was abandoning them in their time of need. Jessica accused me of being selfish, of putting my own desires above the family's well-being. Even Ethan, who rarely spoke, muttered something about how I was being unfair. But this time their words didn't reach me. I had spent too long letting their opinions dictate my choices, and I wasn't going to let it happen anymore. I turned and headed to the basement, their voices following me down the stairs. I grabbed my suitcase and began packing, stuffing clothes and belongings into bags with a mix of urgency and relief. Each item I packed felt like a step closer to freedom. When I finally zipped the last bag, I took a deep breath and carried everything upstairs. They were all waiting for me in the living room, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger. My mom tried one last time to guilt me into staying, her voice trembling as she reminded me of everything they'd done for me. Jessica's tone was sharper, accusing me of tearing the family apart. But I didn't waver. I told them I loved them, but I couldn't keep living like this. For the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking my truth without fear. As I walked out the door, their voices followed me, but I didn't look back. The weight on my shoulders felt lighter with each step. When I finally reached my car, I paused for a moment, letting the enormity of what I'd done sink in. It wasn't just about leaving the house. It was about reclaiming my life, choosing myself over the constant cycle of sacrifice and neglect. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future, a future that was finally mine to shape. Moving into my new apartment felt surreal. The space wasn't much, a small, one-bedroom unit with bare walls and secondhand furniture, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I didn't have to answer to anyone. No kids barging in, no endless to-do lists that weren't my own. I sat on the couch that first evening, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and allowed myself to breathe. The silence wasn't heavy. It was freeing. The following weekend, I took Lauren up on her suggestion and went to the resort. It was a short drive away, nestled in the mountains, and every mile I put between myself and my family felt like shedding another layer of the weight I'd been carrying. The resort was simple but beautiful, with its cozy cabins, clear blue pool, and walking trails. For 2 days, I let myself relax in a way I hadn't in years. I swam, read novels by the pool, and even treated myself to a massage. By the time I left, I felt lighter, as though I'd reclaimed a part of myself that had been buried under years of obligation. But the peace didn't come without challenges. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my family. At first, I ignored them, but curiosity got the better of me one night. The texts ranged from guilt trips to outright anger. My mom sent long paragraphs about how I'd abandoned them, how Jessica's family was struggling without my help. Jessica added her own complaints, accusing me of being selfish and immature. Even my dad's rare message, though softer, asked if I'd reconsider. I put my phone down, my stomach twisting with guilt for a moment. But as I sat there, I reminded myself why I'd left. Their problems weren't mine to fix anymore. For years, I'd been the one sacrificing, giving, and bending to their needs while mine were ignored. This was my time to focus on myself. The final straw came when my mom called one evening. Her voice was heavy with the tone she reserved for guilt trips, and I could almost picture her sitting at the kitchen table, wringing her hands for effect. She spoke about how much they missed me, how Jessica was overwhelmed without my help, and how family always stuck together. But this time, her words didn't carry the weight they once did. I listened, letting her talk herself into a corner, and when she finally paused, I calmly told her no. No, I wasn't coming back. No, I wasn't going to continue being their safety net. It was the most liberating word I'd ever spoken. After that call, the messages slowed down. I suspected they finally understood that I wasn't going to change my mind. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I filled my days with things I wanted to do, exploring new hobbies, meeting up with Lauren for coffee, and planning what my future could look like. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream without the constraints of others' expectations. One evening, as I sat on my small balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. My journey wasn't over, and I knew there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time, I was living life on my terms. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was free to build something new, something better. And that thought was enough to make me smile.
Bye-bye.